calm criminal.
On the 24th of January 2013, a Russian voice came through the frequency 4,625 kHz and said, MDZHB, MDZHB, 93,882, Nymena 7414. Then it stopped and the buzzing returned. No introduction, no explanation, no acknowledgement that anyone outside of a very specific recipient was ever meant to hear it. That frequency, 4,625 kHz, has been active for decades. If you tune to it on a shortwave radio, what you hear is not music, not speech, not even static. It is a repeating tone, often described as a buzzer, transmitted roughly 25 times per minute. It runs continuously, day and night, year after year. The station is commonly known as UVB76, though that is only one of several call signs it has used. Others have included MDZHB and ZHUOZ. The names change, but the behaviour does not. A constant signal, broken only occasionally by brief voice transmissions in Russian, reading out strings of numbers and words that do not make immediate sense. The signal appears to have started sometime in the late 1970s during the Soviet era. By the early 1980s, it was already established enough that Western listeners had begun documenting it. Even then, it behaved exactly as it does now. A continuous buzzing tone with rare interruptions for coded voice messages. That level of consistency is unusual. Most military or government transmissions evolve, upgrade, or disappear over time. UVB76 did none of those things. It simply continued. Early direction finding efforts traced the signal to a location near Povarovo, a small town roughly 40 kilometers northwest of Moscow. Satellite images and on-the-ground reports later identified what appeared to be an abandoned military communications site in that area. Inside, there were rows of radio equipment, desks left in place, paperwork scattered, and on one wall, a logbook containing the station's call sign. It looked less like a facility that had been shut down and more like one that had been vacated in a hurry. Around 2010, something changed. Listeners began reporting disruptions to the signal. Not silence, not a shutdown, but irregularities. The buzzing would falter, shift, or briefly disappear. In some cases, entirely different sounds came through. Voices in the background, movement, doors opening and closing. At one point, a fragment of music, Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, was broadcast unintentionally, as though something inside the transmission chain had been left open. That detail matters, because it confirms something very specific. The signal is not purely automated. It is connected to a physical location with equipment that can pick up ambient sound. At least at that time, there were people present. Shortly after these disturbances, the signal's apparent origin shifted. Direction finding placed it at a different site, believed to be closer to St. Petersburg. The original Povarovo location remained abandoned. The station did not stop. It simply moved. And through all of this, the core behavior remained the same. The buzzing continued. The voice transmissions continued. The structure did not change. The voice messages themselves follow a pattern. A call sign is spoken, usually repeated twice. Then a sequence of numbers. Then a word or group of words, often unusual, sometimes resembling surnames or coded identifiers. Then more numbers. The message ends, and the buzzing resumes immediately. There is no discussion, no back and forth, no confirmation that the message has been received. Just a one-way transmission. Examples have been recorded for years. UVB76, UVB76, 18008, BROMAL 7427, MDZ8B, MDZ8B 38256, OSOBOB 5914. The words vary, the format does not. These transmissions place UVB76 in a category known as numbers stations, a type of broadcast historically associated with intelligence operations. During the Cold War, similar stations were used to send coded instructions to agents in the field. The messages would be encrypted using one-time pads, making them effectively unbreakable without the correct key. But most number stations follow a pattern of activity. They transmit at scheduled times. They have identifiable formats. Some even go silent for long periods. UVB76 does not behave like that. It does not wait for a scheduled broadcast window. It occupies its frequency constantly. The buzzing is always there, acting as a placeholder, a marker, a signal that the channel is active and in use. That raises a very specific question. Why does a station that only occasionally sends messages need to transmit continuously? If its purpose was simply to deliver coded instructions, it could remain silent until needed. Many other stations have done exactly that, but UVB76 does not allow the frequency to go quiet. It holds it. It fills it with sound, without interruption. That behavior suggests that the signal itself is doing something beyond carrying messages. And that is where the more unsettling interpretations begin. Because in certain types of military systems, a continuous signal is not just a broadcast, it is a status indicator, a confirmation that the system is still functioning, that a connection has not been lost, that a chain of command remains intact. In those systems, silence is not neutral. Silence means something has failed. And if that principle applies here, then the most important feature of UVB76 is not the voice messages or even the codes. It is the fact that the buzzing has never stopped. On the 5th of June 2010, the station broke its own pattern. For years, listeners had grown used to the rhythm. The buzzer would continue without interruption, and when a message came through, it would follow the same structure: call sign, numbers, coded word, numbers again, then immediate return to the tone, clean, controlled, deliberate. That day was different. The buzzing stopped, but instead of a structured transmission, what came through sounded like a live microphone left open in a room that was not meant to be heard. There were voices, not addressing the frequency, but speaking to each other. Chairs moved, something scraped against a surface. It lasted only seconds before cutting out, but it was enough. It confirmed, beyond speculation, that somewhere behind the signal there was a physical space. Not just equipment transmitting a loop, but people occupying a room, working around it. A few months later, another break. This time, instead of voices, a piece of audio leaked through the channel. A fragment of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. It was not announced. It was not formatted like a transmission. It sounded as though it was playing inside the room itself. Picked up accidentally by the same system that carried the buzzer out across the world. Again, it corrected quickly. The buzzing resumed. But by then, the illusion of distance had already been damaged. The signal was no longer just something abstract drifting through the air. It had walls, it had furniture, it had people who could make mistakes. Around this same period, listeners began to document an increase in voice transmissions. Not constant, but more frequent than before, and sometimes longer. Some included multiple groups of numbers. Some used different call signs. The voice itself varied slightly, suggesting more than one operator over time. One recorded transmission began with MDZOHB, MDZOHB 04979, Dimitri 3127. Another ZHUOZ, ZHUOZ 21069, Anna 4255. The words are ordinary on the surface, names, fragments of language, but within the structure of the message, they do not function as names. They function as keys, or labels, or triggers for something else entirely. What makes them more unsettling is their inconsistency. The words are not repeated in predictable cycles. They do not follow obvious patterns. Some appear once and never again. Others recur months or years later without explanation. And always, they are delivered the same way, flat, unemotional, as though the meaning exists entirely outside the voice speaking them. During this period of disruption, something else happened that receives less attention, but may be more important. The signal shifted location, direction finding equipment used by radio enthusiasts and professionals alike began placing the source somewhere other than Poverovo. The abandoned site, once believed to be the origin, remained silent. The transmission had moved, not gradually, not with overlap. It simply began coming from somewhere else. Relocating a broadcast like this is not trivial. It requires coordination, equipment, and access to infrastructure that is not publicly available. It suggests planning, intention, continuity. The system did not fail, it was transferred, and yet, despite the relocation, despite the disturbances, despite the accidental leaks of sound that should never have been heard, the core function remained intact. The buzzer continued. That detail becomes more difficult to ignore the longer you sit with it, because if the signal were merely a relic or an outdated communication method left running out of habit, it would not be maintained with that level of consistency. It would degrade. It would drift. It would eventually disappear. But UVB-76 does not behave like something forgotten. it behaves like something monitored. There have been rare moments where the buzzing has paused longer than expected. Not enough to confirm a shutdown, but enough to create a gap. In those moments, listeners describe a particular kind of tension, not because anything has happened, but because something has not. The expectation is that the sound will return, and when it does, there is a kind of relief, even among those who claim not to believe any of the darker interpretations. That reaction is worth noting because it suggests that, whether consciously or not, people have begun to treat the signal as a baseline, a constant that should not change, and when it does, even briefly, it feels wrong. In systems designed with redundancy and control, continuous signals are often used as a form of reassurance, a heartbeat. As long as it is present, everything is functioning within expected parameters. If it disappears, even momentarily, it triggers a response. The exact nature of that response depends on the system. In some cases, it is as simple as an alert. In others, it initiates a chain of actions that are not meant to be stopped once they begin. The idea that UVB76 could be connected to such a mechanism is not confirmed. There is no official documentation, no direct evidence tying it to any specific protocol. But the structure is there, a continuous signal maintained without interruption for decades, a system capable of relocation without loss of function. Human operators present, but not central to the operation. Encoded messages delivered without context. No public explanation despite widespread awareness. And most importantly, no tolerance for silence. If the purpose of the station were purely communicative, silence would not be a problem. It would simply mean there were no messages to send. But UVB76 does not allow for that. It fills the space constantly, as though the absence of sound would not be neutral, but significant. That is where the dead man's switch theory begins to take on a more defined shape. Not as a dramatic speculation, but as a practical interpretation of the system's behavior. A signal that must remain active, not because of what it carries, but because of what it prevents. There is a particular kind of design philosophy in certain military systems, especially those built during periods of extreme tension. They are not designed to be flexible. They are designed to be reliable under the worst possible conditions. If communication is lost, they do not wait for confirmation. They assume the worst and act accordingly. In that context, a continuous broadcast like UVB76 could function as a simple but effective safeguard. As long as the signal is present, it confirms that the system behind it is intact, that command structures still exist, that nothing has been interrupted. If the signal disappears without explanation, it removes that confirmation. And in systems built to respond to failure, the absence of confirmation is often treated the same as confirmation of failure. That is the part that lingers, not the codes, not the voices, not even the abandoned buildings or the accidental fragments of music, just the sound itself, continuing without pause, as though it is the only thing standing between the current state of the world and something that was designed to happen if it ever went quiet. On 2nd September 2010, a transmission went out that did not fit comfortably with anything that came before it. UVB 76, UVB 76, 94,870, Bliadabraz 7391. The structure was familiar, but the word stood out, not because it was complex or obscure, but because it was crude, out of place. It did not sound like a formal code word. It sounded like something that should not have been spoken at all, let alone transmitted across a system that had remained so rigidly controlled for decades. There are a handful of transmissions like that, small fractures in the pattern, words that feel too human, too careless, as though, for a moment, the discipline surrounding the system loosened just enough for something unintended to slip through. But even those moments never disrupt the structure for long. The call sign is still spoken, the numbers are still delivered, the message still ends cleanly, and the buzzing always returns. That consistency is what makes the anomalies feel more significant, not less, because they are not signs of failure. They are contained, brief, corrected almost immediately, as though the system itself resists deviation. There have been other unusual transmissions, longer ones, more complex ones. In some cases, the voice repeats certain elements, not for clarity, but with a kind of insistence, as though the message is critical enough to justify breaking the usual economy of speech. One such transmission included multiple words in sequence, separated by numbers, extending far beyond the typical format. It did not sound like routine communication. It sounded like escalation. And then, just as abruptly as it began, it ended. The buzzing resumed. There is a pattern in that restraint. No matter how strange the content becomes, the system never allows the irregularity to linger. It absorbs it. It returns to baseline. It continues. That behavior suggests something that is not merely active, but controlled. It is easy to focus on the voice transmissions, because they are the only moments where the station appears to speak directly. But over time, they begin to feel secondary. They are interruptions, necessary, perhaps, but not central. The central feature is the sound that never stops. If you listen to it long enough, it changes. Not in tone or frequency, but in how it is perceived. At first, it is just noise. Then it becomes rhythm. Then, eventually, it becomes something closer to presence. A constant occupying the background, steady enough that its absence would be immediately noticeable. That is the point at which the question shifts. It is no longer, what is being transmitted? It becomes, why must it always be there? There are recordings taken at different times of day, different seasons, different years. The quality varies slightly. The texture of the sound changes depending on conditions, but the signal itself remains. It does not drift into silence. It does not degrade into static. It holds. Even during periods of geopolitical instability, when other systems falter or go dark, the buzzer continues, quietly, indifferently, as though it exists outside of those events, or perhaps beneath them. That kind of persistence requires maintenance, power, oversight. It is not passive. At some point, someone decided that this signal should not be allowed to stop, and then, over the years, that decision was honoured, repeatedly, quietly, without explanation. The relocation of the station did not interrupt it. The disturbances did not interrupt it. The anomalies did not interrupt it. It has never gone silent. That is the single detail that has never changed, and it is the one that carries the most weight. Because in systems where continuity matters more than communication, the signal itself becomes the message, not the numbers, not the words, just the fact that it is still there, a confirmation, a reassurance, or perhaps something else entirely. There is a particular kind of system designed for moments when normal communication is no longer possible. Systems that do not rely on interpretation or response. Systems that operate on presence and absence alone. In those systems, a continuous signal is a simple, reliable indicator. As long as it exists, nothing has failed. Nothing has been lost. Nothing has been interrupted in a way that requires action. If it disappears, even briefly, that assumption collapses. And when assumptions collapse inside systems built for worst-case scenarios, they do not wait to be corrected. They proceed. There is no public record confirming that UVB76 is connected to anything of that nature. No document that ties it directly to any specific protocol or mechanism. But the design aligns. A constant broadcast, a lack of explanation, a refusal to go silent under any circumstances, a structure that prioritizes continuity above all else. It is not proof, but it is enough to make the idea difficult to dismiss, especially when you consider how long it has been maintained. Decades of uninterrupted transmission, through political collapse, through technological advancement, through changes that rendered countless other systems obsolete, and still this one remains, not updated in any visible way, not modernized in any obvious sense, just preserved, maintained, continued. That suggests that whatever purpose it serves has not changed, or that the conditions it was designed for have not yet occurred. There are people who have listened to the frequency for years, not continuously, but often enough to recognize its patterns, its minor variations, its subtle shifts in tone. They describe a strange familiarity with it, not comfort exactly, but recognition. And in that recognition, there is an unspoken expectation that the sound will always be there, that no matter what changes elsewhere, that frequency will continue to carry the same signal, repeating at the same interval, holding its place. It is an assumption that has held true for as long as anyone has been listening, which raises a final, unavoidable thought. If the signal has never stopped, then no one has ever heard what happens when it does. Not once. not even for a moment long enough to confirm it. The buzzer continues. Right now, as you sit here, it is still transmitting, still repeating, still occupying that narrow band of frequency with the same mechanical pulse it has maintained for decades, uninterrupted, unexplained. And if the theory is even partially correct, then the most important thing about UVB76 is not what it is doing. It is what it has been preventing. Because if the sound ever stops, there will be no need for another message.